Well, let's get started. So I guess Ancient Werewolves panel just happened, so I'm sure there's some TF people trying to make their way over. So let me just quickly get started with the introduction. This is the History of Transformation panel. A little bit about me. I've been involved in the, the furry community for about a little under 10 years now, but I've been a fan of transformation since I was a kid. Even before Animorphs was around, Animorphs came out during my childhood. I just like the idea of transforming into different animals. And you'll see that as I talk about my Taoist upbringing, there's a bit of a contradiction with that. So this is a panel I've been doing at a few cons for a few years now. It's evolved, it's grown over time. I slightly update it each time, but I have no script, I have no notes. Everything is kind of all ad-lib based off the history I've been researching and studying for many years now. So a little bit about me. You might know me as an artist. I'm one of the artists here at the Dealers Hall. I also specifically started drawing transformation as a kid. My upbringing, I was raised in a shamanic Taoist family. So I come from a tradition of transformation as not just a piece of history or a piece of fiction, but a living part of specific cultures and religious and cultural traditions. Later on, I went to Johns Hopkins University where I studied genetic biology. Some people might think, oh, did you study genetic biology because you want to learn more about transforming in the and no, that was completely separate, but it did help me, as you'll see with some of my artwork later on, where I use a lot of anatomy for my drawing. And after Johns Hopkins, I ended up vending at cons, where I found out there was a big interest in transformation. And if you've seen my booth, I focus a lot on transformation with my stuff. I've been working on my own book called the Shapeshifters Guidebook. It's actually helping me more with world building, but I've been researching the history of any instance of human to animal or human to object transformation throughout different cultures. And as you'll see, there's a lot of similarities, just like how the flood story has been common across all cultures across time. The idea of human to animal transformation is ingrained within human culture, folklore, mythology, and religious traditions. And to make things a little bit easier, we're going to break down this panel into 3 parts. We have about an hour and a half, so hopefully it'll fit nicely. Each half-hour block is going to cover each of these parts. And I'm going to divide it for specific reasons. First, because, like I said, a lot of these traditions are still very, very sacred to a lot of cultures around the world. I want to specifically separate a lot of shamanic and older traditions from what we call fairy tales and fiction, because while some of us from cultures who grew up separately might not realize this, again, this is a living, breathing tradition. Like I said, being raised Taoist, a lot of Taoists still believe in literal transformations in different forms. So we're going to talk about the first part, which is going to cover a lot of prehistory extending from shamanic traditions, how transformation has become rooted in a lot of religious traditions, and then we're going to talk about the bridge between fables and fairy tales to modern fiction. In modern fiction, we're going to cover transformation in the form of cinema, comic books, novels, and TV shows. And finally, we're going to end with tropes, which will look at tropes within the furry fandom specifically. We'll talk about how transformation has evolved into its own unique subculture within the furry community. And we'll look at different artwork and show how transformation is done in different art mediums. So these are the 3 periods we're going to kind of cover in this book. In this panel, so let's begin. So first, ironically enough, I do 2 panels about transformation. This is the one I normally do, just about human to animal transformation, but I also do another panel called Transformative Art. So if you notice my Twitter handle, Transformative, it's 2 meanings because I like the aspect of transformation, but I like the concept of transformative art. And where these 2 different fields with the very similar title kind of unite is at its roots with shamanic traditions. Every single culture has had its own form of the shaman, the witch doctor, the healer, the medicine man, or the medicine woman, who were the most important people of their time and traditions. So if you go to Siberia, to North America, if you look at Mayan traditions, different Tibetan traditions, even the Druids, Africa, every single tradition has its own form of shamanism. Now, to break down shamanism, I kind of like Alan Moore's definition of how shamanism has kind of become the prototype for almost every single modern profession. The early shamans were the most important people of their culture, tribe, or civilization. In fact, people like Alan Moore would argue that it's because of the shamans we actually got the advent of human civilization through the specialization of labor. But before the specialization of labor, the shamans were the most important people, because not only were they the advisors to the tribal leaders, the chiefs, and the kings, they were also the original doctors, the original psychologists, the original therapists, the original religious priests, the original scientists, the original storytellers. Now, the important roles for the shaman were to tell important moral lessons onto the people, onto the king, onto the leaders that must be passed down from generation. So we have this type of generational storytelling where shamans would take important tales and pass these stories down throughout time. And each time these stories are told, they are literally transformed. So this is where we get one type of transformation. Now, the other aspect of shamanism is what we now call animism, whereas being in touch with the spiritual side of nature. Now, we kind of have a mixed modern context about this because of filtering through a lot of Western cultures, but even today, there are still a lot of shamanic traditions that still have the animalism in their roots. Now, depending on which culture you go to, there's very, very different definitions of what this is. But from my Taoist tradition, for example, is getting in touch with nature and being one with nature and the animals, understanding what we now call the life force, which is translated as qi, throughout nature into the force. And to understand nature means you have to be in tune with nature, which means you can inhabit different natural bodies and spirits. This is where we kind of get the concept of animal spirits or body jumping, astral projecting, but every single shamanic tradition does have this at its kind of roots. So there's these types of shamans, but there's also negative types of shamans. And we're going to have to separate these because if you look throughout the history of transformation, you have the negative types of shapeshifters and the positive shapeshifters. So when we move more towards the negative side, you have what are called evil shamans, but we have evil shamans that have been, again, a common theme throughout almost every single culture. These are separate cultures, separated through time periods, separated by distance. But a lot of commonalities that you see with these evil shamans are that they will use their powers for evil, specifically their powers to transform oftentimes into a predator, oftentimes at night. And their main thing at night is to either eat another person, consume flesh, consume blood. But when you basically boil down all the different translations, it's essentially consuming someone's life force. So we'll see this throughout. In fact, we might be able to link the history of vampirism, which is a completely separate trope, if we want to call it that. But the roots of vampirism and these evil shape-shifting shamans kind of have very, very similar roots. So you go to Somalia, and we have were hyenas, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, who transform at night by rubbing themselves with a stick and normally dig up graves and consume human flesh. You have oftentimes evil or harmful witches, which are a very, very common trope in Latin American cultures and countries, where they would go out at night and consume the human's life force. We can even think of succubi and incubus as a form of this, even though they're not shapeshifters, but it's a very, very common trend that we start to see a lot. After we go through this shamanic period, we have transformation as basically the ability of the gods. Most people say the gods should be before the shamans. Well, people like Alan Moore will argue, well, it was the shamans who basically transcended and created the ideas of the gods through their stories. And this is where we get what we now know as classical mythology. So again, a broad definition because it spans many different time periods from India to Greece to Latin America. But we have shape-shifting as a default ability of the gods. So the gods are just gods. They have almost every single power. Shape-shifting is just one default power they had. It wasn't anything anything more unique than flying or super strength, but you had the ability to shapeshift, and oftentimes shapeshifting would come in the form of trying to go and spy on humans. So we see this a lot, especially in East Asia and the Mediterranean cultures, where gods would kind of come down in animal form, not only to spy on humans, but sometimes to seduce them. Like Zeus is a common example of this. We have examples of gods who have to reincarnate into different forms to try to teach humans important lessons. You see this a lot in Buddhist, Taoist, and Hindu mythology. And we also have gods that are represented sometimes because they're stuck in different regenerated states and half human, half animal forms. I think everyone probably in the furry fandom knows one of the oldest sculptures in human history is one of anthropomorphic animals, and we see this represented a lot within these different gods. Especially in Aztec, Mayan, and Egyptian mythology, you have animal-headed gods. It wasn't that the gods were specifically portrayed of animal heads. It was because it was an amalgamation of all these different forms they've taken on, and sometimes it's a way to represent all these different forms into one body. Now, when we go to Greek mythology, like Zeus, he will take on the form of an eagle, is one of his most common one, come down to earth, seduce people. So these were basically just the superpowers. Now, when the gods do it to themselves, it's considered a positive superpowers. When the gods do it to humans, it's considered punishment. So when a god turns you into an animal, that's not good news. Well, for us, we might like it, but for these ancients, this was considered a very bad punishment. And we see this a lot in Greek mythologies, where the gods will kind of punish, all these different humans that kind of, annoy them or didn't do a sacrifice right or too boastful, and turn them to different animals. So Artemis, the goddess of the moon and goddess of the hunt, most commonly would turn hunters into the wild game that they were trying to hunt, and often have their hunting dogs turn on them and eat them. Of course, we have Arachne, one of the most famous examples of this, of a mortal weaver getting to a contest with Athena and ending up being turned to a spider as a punishment. Then we get to a period where we have a lot of trickster gods pop up throughout all these different traditions. And the trickster gods, one of their main abilities was transformation. While beforehand, transformation was just a default ability of all the gods, once it came down to the trickster gods, that was like their one calling card superpower. So we would have examples like Loki, Coyote, Raven, Maui, even the Monkey King. All these different trickster gods, often demigods, who would kind of come to Earth and play tricks on not just humans, but on different gods, turning to different animal and in some cases inanimate object form. Now, as more and more of the monotheistic religions started to overtake a lot of these traditional traditions and pantheons, so we have the Abrahamic faiths in Africa and Europe kind of spreading, then we have Buddhism kind of spreading east. A lot of these old shamanic traditions were then replaced by these new monotheistic faiths. And since in most of these religious traditions, you no longer have vast pantheon of gods, you only normally had one supreme being, the role of the shapeshifter trickster gods then kind of got passed on to the fairy folks or the fae or the fairy creatures, which are common throughout Eurasian traditions. Specifically in Europe, you would have sprites, brownies, hobgoblins, kobolds, though they aren't the little dragon ones we kind of think of now from the D&D games. They were actually little gnome-like creatures, and they were basically all these different sprite-like creatures were kind of short, little, dumpy humans who would just kind of play tricks on people by turning to different animal or object forms. Oftentimes you have house sprites who would basically live and inhabit a house. They'll sometimes do chores around and hide as a different animal or object around the house. If you treat them nicely, they'll do chores for you. If you didn't treat them nicely, they'll throw dishes around and break things. This is also where you got the concept of the changelings, where in some cases the sprites would kind of take on the form of a human child, abduct the human child, and basically replace that human child. And this is where we get the concept of changelings a lot. We even see this happening up into even modern times of parents who think that their child is not their child because they were actually another creature that was abducted. You can even see this as the root of some alien abduction stories. In fact, if you hear stories of fairies abducting kids from this period, they sound very, very similar to alien abduction stories that we hear of now. In East Asia, we have very, very similar type of creatures. So we could think of the nine-tailed fox and the tanuki as examples of this. In fact, they have their own category. In East Asia, a lot of these fairy folk descend from the Chinese tradition of the Yoguai, which has been translated in many different forms. So you have one definition, which is a literal translation, is strange creatures. You have strange ghosts, demons, and also the traditional, like I said, fairy and sprites. This tradition started to make its way to Vietnam and to Korea, and eventually from Korea to Japan. This is where they became known as yokai. And of course, the most famous ones we have are the tanukis today, and especially the nine-tailed fox, which we're going to have its own separate definition. But in a lot of these traditions, like I was talking about the life force and chi, this is where we get two different types of categories. Right now, they're kind of jumbled into one category right now. They aren't specifically evil or good, it just depends on intention. But we have a lot of different creatures who want to try to absorb human chi. So let's talk about the East Asian definition of reincarnation. So in most East Asian traditions that were especially inspired by Taoism or Hinduism or Buddhism, to eventually get to heaven, you have to be in a human form. And because you have countless lifetimes of reincarnation, most of the times you'll end up in an animal body. And it's believed by doing good deeds in these animal forms, after so many lifetimes, you'll eventually make it to a human body. And after so many lifetimes of being a good human, you'll eventually find salvation and make it to the Taoist, Buddhist, or Hindu equivalent of heaven, or escaping nirvana in some traditions. Now, some animals are able to kind of learn this concept of how to escape this entire concept of reincarnation. Most of the time, these animals would live in the house of a wise master or sage and learn this concept. So in a lot of these traditions, to kind of bypass and escape all these constant cycles of reincarnation, you have a lot of stories of these animals trying to transform themselves into human bodies, and think of it as a way to kind of skip past all these cycles of reincarnation, because one of the risks of reincarnation is you might forget all the memories that you had in the previous lifetime, which means you basically start over from square zero again. So you have two different types of animals that could do it for good or for evil. So you have like the wise creatures who would kind of learn the concept of how to absorb chi and life force laterally, and these creatures would normally have long lifespans, thousands and thousands of years, and because they live such long lifetimes, they would look like giant versions of their former animal self, because it was believed the longer a spider or a fox lived, the larger it got. Then you had animals that wanted to absorb the life force in a different way. And this is where we go back to the evil shamans, where they would kind of eat human flesh or drink human blood or absorb chi through unnatural ways as a way to kind of gain human properties. And in most of these cases, they would look like monsters. They would be half human, half animal abominations, never able to completely obtain human form. And you have a lot of demons in East Asian traditions who are these half animal, half human abominations. And it's sometimes theorized that a lot of these monsters used to live on the Silk Road and eat travelers, and sometimes the gods will come down to Earth every few generations, banish these monsters, and they'll move west and become worshipped as gods. That's why in some Chinese traditions they believe the Aztec and Egyptian gods, for example, are just these type of half-human, half-animal monsters who just ended up making their way there. That's why they still demand blood sacrifice to, consume life force. So you have this unique idea of life force and this concept, and what is unique is it gives rise to one of the most famous types of shapeshifters in East Asian culture, and these are the fox spirits. Nowadays we retroactively use the term werefoxes, but they aren't specifically humans who turn to foxes. These are foxes who turn to humans. So werefox is not a nice definition, but some other definitions we know them by are nine-tailed fox, for example. Or most famously, you might know the term kitsune. So in Japanese and Chinese traditions, these are normally portrayed as more positive creatures, and it's through many lifetimes. Like I said, they live for thousands and thousands of years. It's through each lifetime. Sometimes it depends on which tradition, but if they live every century or every millennium they lived, they would gain an extra tail. And finally, when a fox spirit gains 9 tails, that's seen as one of the most pure forms before they're finally able to achieve human form and go up to heaven. In Korean and Vietnamese tradition, they are not seen as specifically evil, but seen as more monstrous nuisances that are kind of like vampires. Sometimes, specifically within Korean and Vietnamese tradition, they would appear in the form of beautiful women and try to seduce humans into having sex, and by doing so, that's another way to kind of gain a life force. So while werewolves are heavily represented in Eastern and Western European traditions, we're going to see a lot of fox spirits represented in Eastern traditions. So they kind of fill the same niche. Now, because sometimes the foxes are considered werefoxes, they sometimes are in the category of weird creatures. So we're going to kind of break down the weird creature category. We're going to look at some different animals and beings that are considered weird creatures now, and show how they might be similar, but some of them might be different. So a close relationship to these werefoxes and yokai are the werehorses of the Philippines, also called the tikbalangs. So the tikbalangs are kind of similar to the werefoxes, where they aren't specifically starting off as human, but they're not also starting off as horses. So this is where we get the kind of the weird middle ground between the Asian tradition of weird creatures and the European traditions of weird creatures. These are just anthropomorphic horses who can sometimes fully take on human form, sometimes they can fully take on horse form. Now, through the research I've been doing, a lot of these traditions seem to come from the Hindu god Vishnu, who, through one of his many incarnations, was able to take on a horse form. So here's Vishnu's incarnation, where he took on the form of a blue horse. And it was through this incarnation of Vishnu making its way east through the Silk Road, we got what's called the horse. The literal translation of this creature is called horseface. He is one of the guards of hell in Chinese tradition, and he's basically just the guardian of hell, and he has a horse face and a human body. And it's believed that through these different traditions, from the Hindu tradition of the avatars of Krishna being divine, to the more hellish infernal traditions of horse-faced creatures being the guardians of hell, that we had Asian traders finally making the way to the Philippines around the 7th century. And this is where we get that tradition of the tikbalang, because there is no feral or wild or native horses in the Philippine Islands. So they didn't know what horses were when the first Chinese traders came with their horses. And it wasn't really until the Spaniards came centuries later that they actually got to see what horses were again. So it's this weird period where they saw horses initially, didn't know what horses were, and now they're seeing horses again. So we get this weird concept of the weird horse coming from the Philippines. as we start moving more west, we start seeing creatures that become more and more familiar to us, to what we see with the modern day werewolves. So, like I was saying, as werewolves fill a specific niche in Europe, as the fox spirits fill the specific niche in East Asia, the were hyenas fill this niche in Africa, and all throughout Africa, from the North African Barbary coast, including the Arabian Peninsula, all the way down south to the tip of South Africa, we have different variations of were hyenas. A lot of these traditions were very separated, but a lot of them do have a lot of specific overlapping features. So the were hyenas are often seen as negative creatures. So unlike the were foxes, where they're mostly seen as positive, we start seeing the were hyenas seen as a more negative creature, and this again connects back to the evil shaman traditions or the evil witch doctor traditions. Now in Somalia, we have a type of were hyena, though I'm not going to try to pronounce that phrase, but it translates to one who rubs himself with stick. And this is where we get one of the instances of a weird creature that has a specific transformation trigger, which we'll talk about later when we talk about transformation trope. But a transformation trigger is normally an enchanted item or object that induces transformation. Now for these were hyenas, they would start off as humans during the day. At sundown, they will rub themselves with a magic stick and turn into a hyena man, normally dig up graves or go prey on different humans, and they will need to rub themselves back with that stick to turn back to human form before sunrise. And I'm not sure, I haven't seen any specific tales about this, but it's interesting because there could be chances where if this were hyena was not able to get their stick in time before the sunrise, they might be stuck in that form. Now, I haven't seen this in these traditions, but I think it's an interesting trope that we have adapted in a lot of modern day stories, as we'll talk about later. But one of the most interesting traditions, specifically when you go through when you start at Ethiopia, go west, and then go south, you have this large area of Africa. Even though the were hyenas have different names throughout these different diverse tribes, they're almost always connected with blacksmiths in Central Africa, and I think that's really fascinating. So the idea is if you are from a family of blacksmiths, you're also a were hyena. That's like one of your default abilities. Now, this could be taken in a positive or negative light. So, for example, when Ethiopian Christians were persecuting Ethiopian Jews, they would often associate Jews as being were hyenas because most of the Jewish families were also the blacksmiths families of that time period. And then when you go even down south, you have different types of were hyenas. So here's one that I drew. Where I tried to take it based on very close to how they would portray them, where they would have the elongated limbs, more anthropomorphic, larger than a regular hyena, but still have the hyena features. So you have, and especially if you look at medieval artwork, you'll see a lot of drawings of hyenas digging up graves. This might also come from the idea that were hyenas would dig up graves during the nighttime. And what's interesting is when I was actually a student at Johns Hopkins, when I was working at Barnes and Nobles, there was like a period where there was 2 were hyena books in the kids section at the same time. I always thought that was kind of fascinating. So yeah, were hyenas hopefully are making, because I would love to see more were hyena stories because we have too many werewolf stories. It's time for the were hyenas to have some fun. So, of course, we have to eventually get to the werewolves. Werewolves are such a big piece of the puzzle that I don't want to give all the attention to werewolves, but a lot of our modern tropes for shapeshifting do come from werewolves. So who was actually at the ancient werewolves panel that just happened right before? Okay, so that one probably covered a lot of the Greco-Roman werewolf traditions, which I'll quickly cover, but I'm going to focus on how these ancient werewolf traditions influence modern media. So we're going to kind of fast forward during that period and focus on the Christianization of these werewolves. So first, the earliest wolf transformation is from the Epic of Gilgamesh. In fact, it might be one of the earliest accounts of human to animal transformation that was induced by a divine being. And we have a shepherd who was transformed by the goddess Ishtar into a wolf and was actually torn up by their own dogs. So this again connects back. It's very similar to the traditions of Artemis turning hunters into stags or boars and have them torn up by their dogs. So we have this trope that seems to be very prevalent in the Middle East and Mediterranean cultures of turning into a wild animal and being devoured by your dogs. And of course, most people, and this is where in my Shapeshifter School novel and comic series I'm working on, I like to track what we now know as the modern werewolf to this specific legendary king, Laocoon, who was the king of Arcadia, who the story goes, he wanted to test the divinity of Zeus, not believing Zeus was an omnipotent, omnibenevolent being. So he killed one of his own sons. He had a lot of sons. He had like 50 sons. So for him, I don't think it really mattered. But he killed one of his sons, served him to Zeus during a festival held in Zeus's honor, and instantly Zeus knew, okay, yeah, you just killed your son for me, and as punishment, he turned him into a wolf. And this is where a lot of, if you look at a lot of modern mythology and modern stories, a lot of people, like how people trace a lot of vampires to Dracula, a lot of werewolf fiction like to trace werewolves to this specific Greek king of Arcadia. Now, there are many different variations of the story, so I can't cover all of them. But one of the most common variations is specifically there was at this specific festival, you had a lot of different people. Anyone who partook in eating human flesh at this festival was transformed into a wolf. Now, depending on tradition, these individuals were able to transform back to human form and were able to shift between human and animal form. If they abstained from eating human flesh for 9 to 10 years, again, depending on tradition, they would be able to transform back into a human form. So we have one example of an Acadian Olympic boxer who, he's a historical figure, he's a famous boxer, but it's believed he was one of these werewolves who partook in eating flesh during this festival, and because he abstained from eating human flesh for 10 years, he was able to transform back into human form. But, being a wolf for 10 years gave him a lot of athletic prowess, so he was able to be an Olympic champion. So we can even think of, if we think about the werewolves, we can even think of the connections to the early Olympics, which I think are kind of fascinating. So I'm going to fast forward through these periods because I think this was covered in the previous panel, but there's a lot of fun stuff that we see coming from the Greco-Roman traditions. So one of what some people consider the first Western novel is the story of the Golden Ass. And it's funny because the story, when you actually read it, it's about a mortal human who's trying to, learn magic and transform himself into different animal forms. So in this specific case, he's trying to transform into a bird. The spell goes wrong, and he ends up transforming himself into a donkey. So the idea of trying to transform yourself into one form and transforming yourself into a different form is a common transformation trope we're going to start seeing a lot in later fiction and stories. But when we get to Rome specifically, you might know the story of Romulus and Remus, who were the founders of Rome, being nursed by their adopted mother, who was a she-wolf. Now, there are some traditions who try to retroactively connect werewolfism from the Roman tradition with the founding of Rome, because if you were nursed by a wolf, maybe these founders of Rome had some wolf DNA or wolf instincts within them, which is why Rome was such a ruthless city initially, being able to take over all the different Indian cities during this period. And we get a lot of Roman shapeshifters. You have stories of werewolves in the Roman legions. I think one of the funny stories, one of the friends of a Roman soldier noticed his friend was just like randomly stripping his clothing off, and then he just transformed into a wolf and just ran off into the woods. And it's just a random story, but it's like, oh yeah, my friend just stripped naked and just ran out into the woods and turned into a wolf. That's a thing. So we have a lot of these Roman shapeshifters. Now, what's interesting is this starts clashing with the Celtic traditions. So when you look at the Germanic tribes, the Celts, and then later the Norse traditions, you start seeing the skin wearers or the berserkers, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But let's quickly continue with the wolves, because there are some interesting types of werewolves that come after the the Romanization of Europe. Specifically, once Rome adopted Christianity as its main religion, wolves were kind of considered negative. So you remember we have the witch hunts that were very prevalent throughout Europe during this time period. Well, werewolf hunts were also a common thing. So talking about werewolves, okay, there's a lot of stuff here. So let's talk about the Irish werewolves first. So one of the early stories talk about when St. Patrick came to proselytize Christianity to the different tribes of Ireland. One specific village he was preaching to started howling at him to try to drown out his preaching. So depending on which story you go by, either God or St. Patrick, using the power of God, transformed all these Irish pagans into wolves. And it's believed that these wolves were stuck in wolf form every 10 years. Every 10 years they could transform to human form, or every 10 years they would transform into a wolf. Now, it's believed a lot of these stories of pagans being turned to wolves is where we get the negative perception of wolf transformation in Christianity. Now, in the Geography of Ireland by Gerald of Wales in the 12th century, he actually talks about an interesting encounter where a priest in Ireland randomly encounters a talking wolf in the woods one day. And initially he's frightened by this wolf talking in human tongue, but after the wolf starts talking about the Bible and God, he becomes curious, and he finds out this wolf is actually descended from those people who were cursed by St. Patrick, and that his wife is dying, but his wife is still stuck in wolf form, and he's begging this priest to give his wife the last rites. The priest comes to the house and he sees, yes, the wife is still in wolf form, and it actually enters into this theological query. Is it blasphemous to give last rites to an animal, or because this individual is still a human under wolf skin, can we still perform last rites? Now, it doesn't answer the question in this case, but it leads this interesting theory out of, can you do this? And we're going to talk about how early Christians kind of justify werewolves later on. But let's finish with the Irish werewolves. So we have another, outside of Christianity, you have some Irish traditions. This specific kingdom here in the southern part of Ireland is believed to be ruled by kings who descended from a legendary shape-shifting wolf warrior who would carry out raids similar to Viking raids, where he would go a wolfing and basically take on wolf form and basically attack a lot of the English armies who were trying to colonize Ireland around this time. Now, let's go back to the Christian werewolves. So werewolves were kind of considered, it was believed werewolves, a lot of these people during this time period believed werewolves to be real creatures. And that had some questions when Christianity ended up being adopted by the Romans, because it was believed that only God can transform the physical form. So a werewolf would not be able to transform into a human form on their own free will. Even with the powers of Satan or evil, a werewolf should not be able to transform between human and wolf form. So this leads into some interesting conclusions that a lot of these early theologians had to debate. One, werewolves were a punishment from God, where it was oftentimes seen as collective punishment, where a community of people were transformed to wolves, like we were talking about with the St. Patrick and the Irish werewolves, as a form of collective sin. And in this form of sin, they still retain their human thoughts. That's something that we'll see is interesting, because sometimes we see these werewolves instantly lose their human ability to think and become completely feral. In this case, God can transform the physical body into a wolf, but the soul is still human and the mind is still human, which is why there are some theologians who debate, yes, you could give last rites or baptisms to a werewolf in wolf form because they are still human under that skin. And in some stories, after they receive their baptism or last rites, the wolf skin falls out and you see a completely nude human underneath. The next type of werewolf, the next type of justification for these werewolves are you can only turn to werewolves in spiritual form. So you can't physically turn your body into a werewolf, but at nighttime, your soul could take on the form of a wolf, and that's where all these werewolf stories are coming from. Werewolves attacking sheep, werewolves attacking villages. These are spiritual werewolves who are either cursed humans or sinners who are acting out these evil thoughts. Or the third conclusion, werewolves are divine holy creatures blessed by God, because if only God can transform the physical body, then these werewolves must be holy creatures, which contradicts a lot of these werewolf hunts that are happening around this time. And we see this specifically with the stories of the different holy werewolves. Specifically, we're going to start with Saint Christopher. Saint Christopher is often depicted in a lot of iconography with a dog's head. So specifically not a wolf head, but a dog's head. But the theory came because St. Christopher came from the land of Canaan. It sounds like canine when translated into Latin. So it was believed by the Romans of this period that people who came from Canaan were actually dog-headed beings. So St. Christopher was often represented with a dog's head during this period. And because of this, there are a bunch of different stories of how this iconography came to be. One theory goes by historians, is to convert the Egyptians, specifically within Coptic Christianity, to convert the Egyptians to Christianity, to replace the iconography of Anubis. They would use the iconography of Saint Christopher as an equivalent of Christian worship to replace these old pagan traditions. The other stories go that Saint Christopher couldn't descend into heaven until he fully accepted Christ, and by fully accepting Christ, he finally lost his wolf head and became fully human. And we start seeing how this mirrors, like I was talking about in the East Asian traditions of having to reincarnate into human body to finally ascend to heaven. You start seeing this in Christianity, in the Christian tradition, where even if you can shift between human and wolf form, you still have to be in human form before you can finally ascend heaven. And this goes with some of the variations of the St. Christopher story. Now, we have people who were captured during these werewolf hunts and try to justify why they are werewolves. And some people will even argue, yes, I am a werewolf, but I'm a werewolf for God, using that definition of only werewolves can be given their ability by gods. And this is where we get different variations of the holy werewolves, specifically in Italy, where you can't transform your physical body. So these, like I was talking about the spiritual transformation of the soul to an animal form, these were holy werewolves who would turn to wolves during their sleep, go down to hell, battle the demons and devil, and try to save some souls and bring them back. So you have this concept of people who admit, yes, I'm a werewolf, but I'm a werewolf for God. So very interesting, which is why the werewolf hunts were kind of seen separately from the witch hunts during this period, because you couldn't have a holy witch, but you could have a holy werewolf. Now, we kind of see werewolves in a negative tradition and negative light now, but through these ideas of trying to justify werewolves as holy beings, you start seeing more heroic wolf creatures pop up during this period. Specifically in France, we have a lot of different stories of werewolves who had their human clothing stolen by their cheating wives, and because they lost their human clothing, they can't transform back into human form, so they're stuck in wolf form. So this is going to be the opposite of the berserkers, who have animal pelts and can only transform back into their animal form once they receive their pelts. So this story appears many times in French tradition, and specifically was even adapted into an Arthurian legend. And okay, it looks like we are running out of time, so I'm going to have to quickly go past this. One specific case had a knight who was serving a king after his wife stole his clothing after cheating on him. He was stuck in wolf form for about 7 years. The king he served noticed this wolf was obedient to him and very tame, and decided to take him on during his raids and hunting parties. And it was only when the werewolf would only bark and attack his wife and the person she was cheating on with that the king realized this wolf had a connection to these two, and eventually was able to help his wolf friend get his human clothing back and finally able to transform back to human form. Now, this is where we kind of get werewolves as the villain. As we start moving from the legendary mythology period to the more fairy tale fable period, we start seeing more of the big bad wolf type stories. Now, nowadays, when we think about the big bad wolf, we don't really think of it as a werewolf. But if you actually look at some of these old stories, especially if you look at the early versions of Little Red Riding Hood, how was it that the wolf was able to disguise himself as the grandmother? Nowadays, we kind of think of the funny scene of a wolf just wearing the grandmother's clothing and glasses. But in some early variations of the stories, again, there's so many different variations of Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf actually took on the form of the grandmother, but with some carryover wolf features. And we're going to talk about this. This is called morphic resonance, where some characteristics of the animal form appear in the human form, and vice versa, where some aspects of the human form appear in the animal form. We're going to talk about that when we go to the furry art form. But the Big Bad Wolf story appears many times: Peter and the Wolf, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, The Three Little Pigs, and of course Little Red Riding Hood, where we have this negative perception of the wolf. And I also want to kind of quickly point out that Dracula might be considered a werewolf as well, and he might be considered one of the first werewolves who had his transformation induced by moonlight. So when we think about werewolves transforming under the full moon, that's more of a modern conception. We don't see this represented in a lot of the old stories. Now, it might be there symbolically, as in the original wolf transformation story with Ishtar. She transformed him, the shepherd, under moonlight. But when we finally get to the story of Dracula, again, the vampiric traditions continued with that, where he would try to steal life force in the form of human blood, take on many wives. But Dracula would also transform into not just a bat, but into a wolf during certain periods. And moonlight was described in the original story every time this wolf transformation take place. So there are some theories this is where the moon-induced transformation, which later inspired the werewolf movies that we'll see in the 1930s. But going back to fairy tales, most transformation can fall under the ATU motif index. So this is what I specifically use. I don't see as many people who study transformation in academia use this, but I specifically use this for my own classification because while it's kind of flawed, it's a very handy archetype motif for studying transformation. So in the ATU motif index, it was developed by 3 different scholars of trying to classify world fairy tales and folklore into one giant continuum. It's basically how we see the hero's journey as described by Joseph Campbell. These scholars are trying to describe all these different motifs and tropes throughout different cultures in this motif index. So when we go to, for example, if we want to talk about werewolves, it will be under this classification. Category D are all the stories that involve magic. When you go to D0 to D699, this involves all types of transformation magic that is based around transformation. Then when we go to 100 to 199, this is specifically human to animal transformation. Then D113 is specifically human to canine transformations. You go further, so 113.1 is human to wolf transformation, and then D113.1.1 is periodic transformation, which is where we get werewolves. So most transformation stories and tales can be retroactively classified in an index similar to this. And during this period, a lot of transformation stories appear in fairy tales. Of course, we have the Frog Prince, we have Beauty and the Beast. And this quickly leads us on to the next type of transformation I quickly want to cover. Again, these are all different types of transformation stories, but we have what I call the skin-treading transformation. Some people might use skinwalkers or skin wearers, but that's a Navajo tradition, and I don't want to conflate the Navajo tradition, which is sacred to them, with this motif that we keep seeing in East Asian and Western European traditions. So specifically, I'm going to use the term skin shedding transformation for this. So this is where we talk about the Norse berserker, which I was mentioning earlier, which were believed to be Viking raiders who, if they wore the pelts of bears, could transform into a bear form. Taking off these pelts, they could transform back into human form. It's believed that these berserkers descend from Germanic Celtic traditions where you have people who could wear the skins of wild boar and transform into boars, or the skin of wild wolves and transform into wolves. So I'm surprised this story hasn't been done yet, but if I have time in the future, I might do it. But having the skin wearer Celtic wolves versus the Roman werewolves might be a fun story. Two different wolf shape-shifting cultures clashing in Germania during this time period. Now, what's interesting is within this tradition, we have the animal bride motif. Going back to that motif we were talking about earlier, we would have a lot of stories of male humans seeing a beautiful woman bathing in the pond, and her animal skin is off to the side. Oftentimes, if she put on this animal skin, she would transform into a swan, a crane, a seal. This is where we get the silkies from, or a fox. And they will run back into the animal form to the wild. And oftentimes, this human would, if they catch this bathing woman again, would steal the skin, prevent them from turning back to human, and force them to stay in human form and marry them, take them all as a wife. Normally, this husband would hide the animal skin in a chest under the bed. Sometimes he would procreate and have kids with this animal bride. But eventually, the wife will eventually find her skin. And after she puts on her skin, she leaves the house, and all the kids transform to animals and leave the house with them. It's a very common motif. So what's interesting is it's most common with bird shape-shifting traditions. So in Western Europe, you could, if you look up swan maidens, most of these animal brides are swan maidens, where these are swans who would take off their feathers, transform into animal form, and the same story goes. What's interesting is in Japan you have the crane wife, which is a very similar tradition, but in this case it's often the crane wanting to help repay someone who saved them. Normally it's a crane who was trapped in a net. A human male would save them, goes back home, sees a beautiful woman helping cook for him, sew for him, and she would often sew these beautiful silk cloths and allow him to sell them in the market and fetch a lot of money, though her sewing techniques will always be kept in secret. And it was only after the husband barges in one day and actually sees a crane taking off her feathers and sewing them into clothing that he realizes, oh, I married the crane I saved. And at that point, the magic is lost and she has to leave and they can never be united again. So two different variations of a very, very interesting theme across two different cultures. Now, another type of transformation motif that we start seeing develop in a lot of these traditions is the transformation chase or the transformation battle. If you see Sword in the Stone, where Merlin was battering Madame Mim, that's a perfect example of this. But you often see stories of, oftentimes it's an apprentice trying to escape a wise wizard or an evil witch who abducted this apprentice as a child. And this apprentice is trying to escape, oftentimes in the form of prey. So he tries to escape the house as a mouse. The witch or the sorcerer would transform into a cat and try to chase them down. Then he jumps into the river, transforms into a salmon or trout. The master would transform into a shark, flies in the air, transform into a swallow. The master would transform into a hawk, so on and so forth, until oftentimes this is where me as a lover of inanimate transformation sees the value of inanimate transformation. The student or apprentice would oftentimes transform themselves into a grain of wheat or some inanimate object that's easy to hide, and the master would turn themselves into a chicken, peck the grains of wheat, eat them, and there you go. Inanimate TF ends with war. So that's how the story ends. If you saw the new Puss in Boots movie recently, everyone loves Puss in Boots. You might forget that the original Puss in Boots story actually had them battling the ogre, which is why actually Puss was introduced in the second Shrek movie, because only Puss in Boots could defeat ogres. And how did the original Puss in Boots defeat the ogre? Well, the ogre was also a shapeshifter in a lot of these early traditions. He could turn into a dragon, a lion, and elephant. And Puss, to try to trick the ogre, was like, oh, you could transform into all these powerful forms, but can you turn into something as small and simple as a mouse? And the ogre's like, I can turn into a mouse. Once he transformed into a mouse, the cat goes and eats him, and there you go. That's an easy way to defeat it. Again, transformation battle that ends with war. That seems to be very common during this period. Now, so I almost took a complete hour to talk about the first part, so I'm going to quickly go through modern media, and then hopefully we have time for the last part. But let's go back to werewolf, since that's where a lot of people like to go. Werewolf movies started becoming popular. So the first werewolf movie was in 1913. It was just called The Werewolf. But the one that popularized a lot of the modern tropes of werewolves was Werewolves of London, which was made in 1935. This is one of the first instances, well, there have been some retroactively dated, but this is one of the early instances of a werewolf bite being able to transmit the ability to turn into werewolf. You rarely see this in a lot of the older myths. The only tradition I can find is the Cajun tradition in Louisiana, where if you abstain from Lent and you're not a good practicing Catholic, you turn into a type of werewolf that can bite other people and turn them into werewolves. But this is one of the earliest examples where it was codified as a ability to transform, and moonlight causing a transformation is also where this was also solidified, this specific movie, Werewolf of London. Now, in 1941 is when we get the most popular image of the werewolf, the Wolfman. So most transformation to werewolves during this time period, unlike the werehorses or the werehyenas, which were half hyena or half horse, half human forms, most wolf transformations up to this period were transforming their human body into fully feral wolves, all fours. They might be bigger than a normal wolf, but they were still on all fours and have anthropomorphic forms. Now, because there's this early cinema and movie magic was very, very hard during that period, the only way to accurately represent someone turning to a wolf is through prosthetics. And of course, since you can't have someone looking completely like a wolf, this is where you get the half human, half anthro form of the wolf that we associate with modern werewolves. And this specific movie is also where we get the weakness to silver, which is a trope that was really only introduced during this period. Now again, people go retroactively update earlier werewolf stories and try to add moonlight, transmitting lycanthropy, and weakness to silver as a thing, but really when we look at the history, it was only during this period where a lot of these tropes started being solidified. Now during the golden age of cinema, we also have the golden age of comics, which after World War II gave way to the silver age of comics. So I'm just going to mash a bunch of different entertainment mediums together here, just so we can quickly go through them. But the silver age of comics is also solidified with a bunch of hokiness and silliness. This is where we get a lot of the silliest versions of Batman and Superman and Spider-Man, for example. But animal transformation was often a really common theme in these early, silver age Superman comics, and this is also where we get a lot of shape-shifting superheroes. So we have Beast Boy, for example, and the Wonder Twins from the cartoon series, and this is also where we get the idea. I notice this as an interesting trope that the shapeshifter of the group, if there's a group of superheroes, you almost often have one shapeshifter in a team of superheroes, and the shapeshifter is always the comic relief character. Look throughout almost every single superhero team, it's always the shapeshifter who's the comic relief character, which I also found interesting. Marvel recently has been updating their superheroes. So of course we have Good Boy, who's actually I like this one's a female human who transforms into a male werewolf. We have the new Kamala Khan Miss Marvel series right now on Disney Plus, but since she was elastic, she could also transform her body into different shapes. In some of the earliest comics, she could take on animal form. And we even have this new a human who could turn into different dinosaurs in one of the newer Marvel comics. Unfortunately, these characters never last more than a few issues, so they don't really stick, which is really, really sad because I would like to see more of these characters about. But going back to cinema, for some reason, shapeshifters in cinema is dominated by canine transformation. If it's a horror movie, it's oftentimes they turn into a werewolf. If it's a silly slice of life comedy, they oftentimes turn into a dog. And it's always canines. It's either you're a dog or you're a wolf. There's like no in between. So it's really, really weird that transformation is shoehorned into these two vastly different categories. So Shaggy Dog is a perfect example of the more comedic side, and of course all the different variations of werewolves. And this is also during the period where we get the idea of puberty inducing the transformation. So both in Shaggy Dog and Teen Wolf, for example, the idea of teenage puberty inducing the transformation becomes very, very common. And this is where we see it carry over to a lot of modern fiction as well. Going back to the dog transformation, for some reason, there's like a period where almost all the stories are human to dog transformation stories. In fact, this story has been translated so many different times. The Dog Days of Arthur Kane. Again, Wish Gone Awry, he turns into a dog. And we see this motif happen many times within a lot of the kids' fiction during this period. Wolf is another example of a boy who turns into a dog. And this one's actually interesting, the Max, Me, and the Time Machine, where two kids go back in time. One of them ends up in the body of a knight, the other kid ends up in the body of a horse. Interesting enough, all these works also were adapted into one live-action movie, one live-action TV show, Wolf was. I think it spanned for about 6 seasons, and kind of like Doctor Who, had like 3 different kids play the role of the titular characters, and always transform into a wolf. I kind of like the opening credits where you can see the sneakers on the dog form, so this is where we get some form of morphic resonance. A lot of fun adventure stories happen around this time, and again, a lot of kids fiction. It seems all the unique transformation stories happen in kids fiction around this time, whether it's witches, where we have the witches turn the humans into the kids into mice. And for some reason, we got 2 fish transformation animated movies like during this period. So, that's a thing. Then in the 90s, when we had the straight to VHS series, you had a lot of people. I think it was an intentional way to try to knock off Animorphs. You had a lot of straight to VHS home movies of kids turning to animals, and they're not as good as they look like on the cover. Like, this movie has David Bowie, but this scene never happens in that movie. That would be cool, but this didn't happen. And we have Shapeshifter here as well, which was supposed to be a knockoff Animorphs. There's barely any transformation in the story as well. Kids fiction, like I said, a lot of kids stories also involve transformation, and for some reason there was also a lot of bug transformation during the 80s and 90s, which continued on to the modern day. During the 90s, I think in 90s and early 2000s, we got some of the best transformation stories. Specifically, Animorphs, I think, was the one that really started a trend. You had the Shapeshifter, which kind of, I think, was really trying to copy the Animorph thing, but tried to do its own separate take. Both of these were separate series, and there's actually a new German shapeshifting story that hasn't been translated into English yet, that I haven't added to this panel yet, but I want to include it. But 90s animation also had a lot of shape-shifting stories. So Street Sharks, we might forget, actually involves a lot of transformation as well. People might forget Dino Squad. That's another one where people transform to different animals. So I'm going to quickly go through these because we have a lot of time. But if you actually look through your childhood, you might notice almost all the stories that you liked and TV shows you liked had some form of shape-shifting. So of course we had Beast Boys, but then we had American Dragon, which was about a kid who could turn into a dragon. Almost every single episode of Magic School Bus, even the modern day Magic School Bus, involved transformation. And one of the most popular animated shows of that time period, Ben 10, you might forget, is technically a story about transformation. You could transform all these different alien forms. And like I was saying about the idea of every time you have a team of superheroes, the gag character, the shapeshifter is always a gag character, a comedic relief character. Well, this seems to happen a lot in a lot of anime and cartoons during this period as well. And my theory is the gag character, it's the gag character trope, because a lot of times the shapeshifter has a sad, tragic backstory. So to kind of combat the sad, tragic backstory element, you make him the gag character. So we had werewolf stories also adapted for kids during this period as well. Here's another bug transformation story. This is one that one of my friends who works in a library introduced me to lately, Class Critters, which is a series about kids turning to different animals in each book. Switch is also very similar to that as well. And of course we have to go all the way back to Japan where we talk about anime, because anime has a lot of transformation there. So one of my favorite series during my childhood was KO Beasts, which this is where we had the transformation trigger takes place. For example, the main character Juan, he transforms into this anthropomorphic lion every time he sneezes. So this is one instance of a trigger that is based off a physical reaction. Fruit baskets is another example of a transformation trigger. Every time one of these characters are hugged, they transform into an animal in the Chinese zodiac. Let me see, we have time. And for some weird reason, this is another thing I noticed, because there's a lot of tropes. I think I'm the only one who's really collecting all these different niche tropes together. But for some reason, whenever you have a Mon series, so Mon series, the Digimon, Pokemon, that type of thing, where you have, you know, people battling with different monsters, you always have an incarnation of a Mon series where the characters transform into the monsters they are battling. And in the cases where you have the characters transform into the animal they're battling, in most cases, the protagonist always turns into a blue canine for some reason. So, so we have Card Liver, for example. The main character transforms into this blue wolf. You had Card Vanguard, where his first form in the first episode, he transformed into this weird wolf-like creature. Digimon Frontier, he turns into a robotic wolf, which is kind of cool. And of course, Pokemon Mystery Dungeons, you could turn into a Lucario, so that's kind of fun. Disney is the other group we have to mention. So almost every single Disney is a transformation story. Go back and look. Every single Disney movie has some form of transformation. Even the first Disney animated movie, Snow White, it's maybe not a transformation you like, but the evil queen transformed herself into an old hag. That's a transformation right there. Maleficent transformed herself into a dragon. Of course, one of the most famous transformation, that's either Nightmare Horror Fuel or someone's childhood upbringing, is the Pinocchio Pleasure Island, where people turn into donkeys. You had an entire movie, you know, Emperor's New Groove, about turning to a llama. Brother Bear was, again, another transformation stories. And one of the few examples where an animate transformation was actually done in a positive light was Beauty and the Beast, where you had the servants turn to household objects. And, of course, the main character was a prince who turned into a beast as well. And Disney's continuing the tradition. Almost every single Disney movie, even the last 2 years, almost every single Disney movie, Turning Red, Luca, even Soul and The Last Dragon, there's actually transformation in those movies as well. If you think about body swap as a type of transformation, yes, Soul was a transformation stories. One thing I need to note is, unfortunately, for some reason in modern day, a lot of these transformation stories involve black protagonists, and it's because we live in a horrible racist society where people don't want to see black protagonists on the screen. So let's make our black protagonist a frog or a cat for most of the movie. So unfortunately, it's a sad trope where it's a black main. If it's a black main character, he's transformed into an animal. We can see that new Will Smith movie where he was turned into a pigeon for most of the movie. It's like, that's actually kind of cool that he turns into a pigeon, but again, it's a harmful trope that keeps on popping up again and again. So hopefully we'll move beyond this, because there's a lot of fans who are African fans who love TF. So hopefully it doesn't become a harmful trope and we can move past this. But unfortunately, it's dominated the last decade. Going back to Luca, I really like this scene in the end credits where you have Luca sticking his hand into the fishbowl to show his classmates a transformation. And I really love the scene where he's posing in his form. Like this is something that you could if you go on Fur Affinity, you see artwork similar to this, and I think it's funny that Luca also included this. So now we go to the modern day. We go to the furry fandom. A lot of transformation was born out of webcomics. If you looked at webcomics between the 90s and late 2000s, a lot of transformation webcomics. In fact, there's so many transformation webcomics. I think TV Tropes have its own subcategory of this transformation webcomics. So they are everywhere. I can't go through all of them. Some of the artists of these webcomics are actually in the dealer's den, so make sure to check them out. But because of the popularity of these webcomics, one of them actually involving a shapeshifter was adapted into was actually collected as a graphic novel. We started seeing a lot more graphic novels involving transformation. So we have Mooncakes and Witch Boys, which are two modern examples. Oftentimes they're done by First Second or Scholastic's comics imprint. So transformation actually makes sense because it's an easy way to represent coming of age. So like we saw the early Shaggy Dog and Werewolf stories where puberty is what brought on transformations. We could see transformation as a coming of age stories in a lot of these more modern stories. In most cases, there are female protagonists who are queer or lesbian characters or trans characters, and it's a great actually way to represent trans issues or queer gender issues in the form of animal transformation, which is why we see a lot of queer creators using transformation in this type of outlet. And of course, we have adaptations of earlier transformation stories in the modern day being readapted into graphic novels. So like I said, the aforementioned Witches and the Animorph series have recently got graphic novel editions. And specifically in Witches, I like this specific page where you had the boy turn to a dolphin, this girl would turn to a hen. Parents were heartbroken, but at least now they had fresh eggs every morning. And for the few inanimate TF lovers like myself, I like that this kid was turned to a statue and just ends up being used as a coat rack for his family. All right, so when we go into more furry fiction, we could see so all the fiction we just covered, from the ancient traditions all the way to the modern media, transformation falls under 3 separate categories, and there's some theories about these, my theories of why these different stories appeal to us. First, we have the curse situation, and this is more seen as this is often seen in horror fields type stories. So most situations where a transformation is a curse, it's a horror story, or it's a submissive story where someone is taking on a submissive role. The opposite of that is where transformation becomes a power fantasy. So this is where we get the powerful werewolves and superheroes who can transform to large forms. For example, the Hulk, for example. You might not think about it. The Hulk is also a transformation superhero who has his own transformation trigger. Getting angry is his transformation. This goes into the power play fantasy of transformation. And the last one, which I think a lot of furries are interested in, is the escapism aspect. So I talk about escapism a lot in a lot of my panels, but escapism seems to be the main factor of transformation in the furry community, which is why you will see more stories and comics involving escapism than you see the first 2 categories. These first 2 categories dominate modern current mainstream media, while escapism seems to dominate a lot of furry art and culture. So let's break it down. So let's look at the different artwork that the furry community has produced lately. We're going to talk about the different types of transformation artwork, and then I'm going to talk about tropes I developed, and then talk about my own comics that I've used some of these tropes in. So again, I studied genetic biology at Johns Hopkins University, so I kind of took my anatomy lessons and classes and used them for some of my old artwork. So here are some pieces I've done recently where I tried to draw an anatomical transformation of a human hand into a paw. Here's one where I showed the skulls and the head transformations. Here's where I overlaid the skulls with the human faces as they slowly transform to the wolf body. We could see the elongation of the skull here, the cranium right here. And we also see the shifting of the eye sockets, where the eye sockets are pointing outward. But once we get to the canine form, the eye sockets are actually pointed to the side. And we also see the nose, which has the nose as we know it is actually made of cartilage, so we actually see the nose as more indented inward, especially when we get into the wolf form. Now, I use these anatomical drawings that are more realistic and apply to more cartoony forms. So I draw in a bunch of different styles. So here's my closer to more realism stories that I use for my tarot cards. This is more my cartoony drawings that I do, and you can see what I'm doing here in all these 3 cases is what's called sequence transformation. So sequence transformation is when you have in one picture, you have the human form, the final animal form, but also a midway point form where you combine the human animal shape together, and you have some of the carryover features. So here are some sketches I did of a weird deer. So you can kind of see where I was trying to sketch the different formattings of the eyes and face. Here's one where I did of a weirfish. So this was kind of fun, just to try a weirfish transformation right here, where I tried to make his hair represented in the fin right here. And so let's look at the sequence transformation first. So this is my friend, Curious Red Fox. You can see himself transforming himself into a Jolteon. So again, human form, midway transformation form, and final form. So this is where we kind of get the most common type of transformation artwork, heavily inspired by the Animorph book covers where we see the sequence transformation take place. Here's one of my examples of drawing myself turning into a Leafeon plushie. So you could see a lot of common elements. One, you have looking at your features as a transform. So you see this in a lot, and like 90% of all transformation artwork is someone looking at their hand turning to a paw or something. So you can see I represented this transformation here, and the eye is on the paw the entire time. And this is where I show the baggy clothing, and the final form we have the clothes to size ratio, which you're going to start seeing a lot in transformation artwork. So there's 2 types of final transformation forms. If someone turns into an animal that's smaller than their normal self, they're normally consumed by all this baggy clothing. If someone turns into a form larger than themselves, like if they turn into an elephant, then normally all the clothes is bursting off them. Here's another study I did. This is a gift art I did for a friend where someone's turning into a sea lion. And you can see I also tried to draw the different angles, focusing on the head. trying to keep the shape and nose formed, and also trying to draw a study of the flippers. So this was about 3 years ago when I drew this one. Here's another one I did on my D&D character, transforming into a deer. You can see a lot of the features carry over, the hairstyle carry over. This is what we call morphic resonance. So morphic resonance is when you have features from one form carry over to the animal form. In most cases, it's human features carry over to the animal form. So in this case, I have freckles in the hair and the eye color carry over. You see this a lot in clothing transformation, that involves clothing. So if someone's wearing glasses or wearing a bandana in their human form, oftentimes when they get to their animal form, they still are wearing that bandana or their glasses. So here's one of my good friends, my old roommate, drawing mid-transformation. So this is the next step. So if you don't have time to draw the whole sequence, most people kind of get lazy. So I just want to draw one stage of this transformation. So how do you represent transformation and don't want to draw a sequence? Well, you focus on the mid-transformation. That's the easiest way to represent the transformation. So mid-transformation is very, very simple. You exclude the first two steps. You know that center part of the Animorph book cover that people crop out and post on Twitter and say Nightmare Horror Fuel? Well, that's basically mid-transformation. It's the Nightmare Horror Fuel section of the center. So this is a good example of my friend Ikran. She drew this, and you can see her horse form transforming. You can see this unique take on the hooves. We can see the fingers still in the hooves. And this one tells a full story. So right now we could see what the transformation trigger is based on this glowing enchanted object. So we know this is what's causing the transformation. We have the glasses. Again, glasses are always a nice touch when you draw a transformation kind of falling off the face. And like I said, when you turn to an animal larger than yourself, you have the bursting clothing. So here's a mid-transformation I drew of myself turning to one new starter Pokemon from the new series. And you can see how I drew the baggy clothing around me. So the exact opposite, unlike the clothes bursting, you have the baggy clothing forming around you. And again, looking at the hand, looking at the paw, common feature you draw. Here's another one I drew of another person transforming into a Leafeon. Again, so more morphic resonance creatures. This character has piercings, lip and earrings. And you can see these earrings are continued over to this form. While the clothing fell off because they're now in a smaller form, the earrings and ear piercings are still in the new form. So here's some other mid-transformation drawings I've drawn. Here's my Pinata character in their midway between their human and animal form. And here's one of the bird transformations I drew based off one of the old Fruit Loop commercials. And here's some more sketches to do. It's another one of my D&D character halfway transforming into a wolf. You can see staring at their paw. And this is a quick sketch I did of someone transforming halfway into a tiger. Depending on which step you want to do, it depends on how close you want to get to human form. So here's 3 different weird deer I've drawn over the last 2 years. In this side, you have the weird deer closer to human form. So basically it still has all the human features, but they have elements of the weird fur of the deer pattern on their body. This one's a more halfway point where you have features of both the human and animal form. And this one is a purely anthropomorphic deer in the final form. So most people then would like to draw the post-transformation. So post-transformation, again, very simple. You look at the Animorph book cover, you take the very last scene, and that's it. That's where you're going to focus on. Post-transformations are a little bit harder to convey that's a transformation, so you have to introduce a lot of narrative elements to show that's a transformation form. So right here, we have both the clothing and the torn pants on this character. So this is my friend Sketchy Mouse. And you could see that this clothing does not fit this animal. So we could have a theory about that. It's because this person was previously not a donkey. This person was previously an animal. And you can see that because this person saying, oh, it's not a problem, is it? And now fumbling with all these different, artifacts. So based on this picture alone, this artist provided all the elements you need that this person was previously a human who now transformed completely into a donkey. You have, again, the glasses, the clothing, and all the different elements. Here's one where I drew the final stage of that Pokemon transformation, where I'm trying to walk in the new Pokemon form, trying to walk on hind legs after being a human and turning into an animal that's normally on all fours is another common element people do with Trolls transformation, because instantly you're going to try to walk on your hind legs, not understanding it to walk on all fours, and while you're distracted, oops, you're captured by someone with a Pokeball. So fun. Here's another one I did for the Year of the Tiger. It's technically still Year of the Tiger, even though everyone's preemptively celebrating the Year of the Rabbit. The Year of the Rabbit is technically in 1 week, but since it's still Year of the Tiger, here's one I drew. You can see ripped clothing. This person has freckles. I had the freckles continued on this form. This person has earrings. The earrings continued on this form. This person also has hair highlights continued on in this form. And you have the tattered remains of the clothing and shoes, which are continued onto their animal form as well. All right. Here's some other post-transformation artwork I've done. So here's one where the clothing is completely torn. This is one of my more cartoony werewolves I use for my transformation potion products. You can see the clothing completely torn. Here's one where we have animate transformation, where we have a sequence and then, oops, the final form. The band-aid is the carryover element for this character. And here's another one where the baggy clothing is around the final form. And this is where we get to the next type of transformation artwork we commonly see in the furry fandom. This is called photo manipulation artwork. Very, very simple. You basically try to take a picture of a human and try to mash it up with a picture of an animal. So we see in both cases, this artist friend of mine, is trying to show their transformation into a snake. I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, but this character has braces. And you can see the braces still on this form. As you'll see later, I have a snake character who also has braces. And you see this one has a more human form, but hints and elements of the shark form. Here was one of my attempts of manipulation I did a few years ago. So this character is turning to a horse. This person still has their braces on, so I photoshopped the braces onto the horse form. I kept the human eye and I kept the human hairstyle. So the most common elements you'll see into the new animal form are the eyes. The human eyes are often the most noticeable features in transformation. In fact, most werewolf stories and movies will still have the human eye in the werewolf form and the hairstyle in the werewolf form. The next type is the transformation comic. So this is my friend Korn, who drew this fun transformation sequence where the Squire of the Night is transformed into a horse. You can see the magic rune here is the inducing trigger element that causes the transformation. And you can see he's a little upset being a horse, but afterwards is confused. Wait, what just happened? Which I think is really fun. A very, very short transformation sequence, but tells the entire story in 4 panels. Speaking of comics, I'm going to talk a little bit about the comics I've been working on. So Would Have Bit You is a webcomic about a snake shapeshifter and a weremouse who end up dating with each other. So vastly different characters. You have the jock who transforms into the mouse, and you have the nerd who transforms into the snake. And the morphic resonance features I have with these characters are the mouse has the ear studs, and the snake has his braces and glasses in both forms. So here's more of the characters. Here's a midway transformation of these characters. And because it's often an element that most people don't point out, I like to have that meta joke of the different characters. Why does your mouse have the ear piercings and why does your snake have braces? Because most people ignore it in these fictions. I'm surprised every time you see a Magic School Bus shows, people don't point out, hey, why does this fox have glasses for some reason? So I'd like to point it out in my comics. There's one of the comics I did where they took a selfie of themselves in animal form and it went viral. Different forms. I'm going to quickly go through them. And here's one where I have a funny element where it seems to be a giant mouse, but ends up being a small mouse in a model playset. This is one where he needs to have a mouse for a science fair experiment, but couldn't find his mouse, so he decided to ask, hey, why would you be a mouse for my science fair project? And I like these tropes where it's like, okay, you know your friend's a dog, hey, can you just pretend to be my pet dog for the week just so you can impress my girlfriend or something? Or have you over for a fair? Or did you just turn to a bird for like a day and I have you around my shoulder just for my pirate cosplay? It'd be fun, right? So I like the idea of people asking their shapeshifter friends to turn to something for like just a while and help them around. And I also like the implications where if you are an animal for a period, that makes a lot of different things kind of awkward. So for example, our character Evan here is a weremouse, so he turns into a mouse, and his classmate here is talking about feeding mice to his pet centipedes. And so, of course, that completely freaks him out because he's a mouse, but this classmate doesn't know that he's a mouse. He can turn into a mouse, so this completely scares him. I also like that there's a lot of cutesy implication that you can do with animal form. Well, mice might be eaten by snakes in wild because they are both shapeshifters. They know that each of them will not, hopefully, eat the other. So transformation can have a lot of different elements in stories. It could serve a narrative purpose or a metaphorical purpose. Here's one of the comics I try to draw completely in shonen manga style. So this is one called Lightsaber, about a guy who turns into a dinosaur pool toy. But in the first issue, I don't point out he's a pool toy. I make it look like he's a dinosaur. So all the elements of the transformation makes it look he's turned into a dinosaur. Then you turn a page and boom, he's actually a pool toy, not an actual dinosaur. This is another one I did. This combines an anime transformation with animal transformation. So this kid could turn to paper, and paper form, he could fold himself into different origami shapes. This one, his friend is trying to fold him back. He folds him into a dragon, and he poofs back, now in dragon form instead of human form. And if you follow my Twitter, I sometimes draw a bunch of silly transformation stories just to kind of represent my moods during the day. So sometimes I like drawing an anime transformation a lot, hence my other username, an Animorphs. Here I drew myself turning into a pumpkin to kind of relax. Oops, it's okay, I'm fine, but it looks like someone tries to use me as a jack-o'-lantern. And this is what I use to represent grogginess, because sometimes I have bad sleeping schedules. I wake up and my head feels like someone just took a chunk of my brain out. So this is how I represent it with this jack-o'-lantern transformation. Here's one. I've adopted the seahorse as kind of my persona recently. I haven't really had a specific persona. My mascot here, Bash, is more of a mascot, but I started representing myself as a seahorse because I kind of like how that entails a lot of different things, because seahorses are kind of more helpless when they're stuck in that form. So this kind of represents the times I have writer's block or artist block. So here's one of the transformations of myself to a seahorse. And I think with that, you guys, if you come to my booth, you could see I have a lot of fun transformation stuff all throughout the stuff. And since we're running out of time, I think this is where I have to end the panel. So thank you all for coming to the panel. Come check out the booth. I have a lot of fun transformation stuff. I have a new werewolf coin. I have the shapeshifter passport. I have my comic series. And with that, thank you all for coming to my panel. I'm having my con transformation panel 30 minutes in the next hotel room. So if you guys are interested in con history, come check that out. But if not, enjoy your rest of your time here at Further Confusion. Thank you very much.